So our next speaker is Holly Wagner, who is an actress, writer, an epilepsy advocate, and lots more. So today Holly will speak about her life with epilepsy. Thank you, Holly.
Hello. As you all know, my name is Holly Wagner, and I am an actress, writer, the voluntary head of social media for the Muir Maxwell Epilepsy Centre, and an epilepsy advocate who just so happens to have epilepsy. Today, I will be giving you all a personal insight into what it is like to live with a condition. I always believe the best way to connect with people is through personal experience stories, showing a little vulnerability and honesty to help others understand and empathise better. This is the first time that I have shared this story in public like this, so here it goes. It's an average Monday morning in October 2007. I'm 13 years old. The night before, we'd got back relatively late from a family holiday. I'd realised I'd left my glasses on the plane, so I had to call the airline to see if they'd been handed in. I was quite stressed, as I hated having to do these types of phone calls. I don't really think anyone particularly enjoys them. The ones that take you through multiple options and play annoying hold music while you slowly start to lose the will to live. My dad was upstairs, and I remember getting through the first few options and then being put on hold. I just seemed to blink, and the next thing I knew, I was lying in the middle of the floor of my dad's study with two paramedics beside me and my dad looking on concerned. They were talking, something about me shaking. My finger was pricked by something sharp. I couldn't move. My body felt so heavy, like lead. I couldn't even raise my arm. I was scared, but I was so tired and my brain felt foggy. I began to pick up more of what was being said. According to my dad, he'd been upstairs and heard a loud thump. He'd called down to me, but I didn't respond. He came down to his study and found me lying on the floor, convulsing. He guessed overall I'd convulsed for maybe 2 minutes, and it took me 10 to 15 minutes to regain full consciousness after that. It was disconcerting hearing that. I had no recollection of it. It then took me another 10 minutes or so until I was able to actually stand and walk. I was taken to hospital to get checked out, but was told it was probably a one-off seizure. I was sent home, but was tired for days afterwards, and I just slept for most of it. That's pretty normal after a seizure, as it puts your body through a lot in a relatively short space of time. So naturally, your body can need time to recover. I'd just like to pause here in my story to clarify a few things for people who might not know much or anything about seizures. A seizure is a disruption of electrical signals in the brain that result in sudden, abnormal, intense, and excess electrical brain activity. When you say the word seizure, most people will probably picture somebody convulsing. This is commonly known as a tonic-clonic seizure. These are the types of seizures that I have, but there are actually many different types of seizures. Some may involve loss of vision and/or awareness, tingling feelings in the arms or legs, or daydreaming, just as a few examples. Going back to my story, a few months have passed. I have a present to wrap for a friend, and the wrapping paper is on the top shelf of a cupboard, so I grab a chair to stand on. As I get down off the chair, a thought flashes through my mind very quickly. Oh no, I'm going to have a seizure. It was the strangest feeling. I was actually aware of myself falling to the ground as I was losing consciousness and as this thought crossed my mind. I can actually still picture it vividly, seeing the top of the stairs on the landing as I was falling to the ground. Like last time, I opened my eyes what seemed like a second later as a paramedic was entering the room. So that was my second seizure. I was referred to a pediatric neurologist and received an EEG, a test that records electrical brain activity. Small electrodes, sensors, are stuck onto your scalp with a special glue or paste, and the electrical signals are recorded on a machine and monitored by a specialist. For my EEG, lights were flashed in front of me that started off as very slow pulses, but that gradually increased in frequency and intensity. This was to test whether my epilepsy was photosensitive, which it wasn't. It was after my EEG that I was officially diagnosed with epilepsy, a brain condition in which there is a tendency to have repeated seizures. It was a scary time. None of us knew anything about it, and I was terrified I'd have a seizure at school in front of everyone. I was put on Epilim, also known as sodium valproate, to control my seizures. Although the medication seemed to do its job, I hated it. The side effects I experienced included weight issues and depression. In all honesty, it was a horrific time of my life. I was dealing with this newly diagnosed condition, and we had no idea what caused it or my seizures, whether the medication would actually work, and I was also having to adjust to the medication side effects I was experiencing. I told very few people at school because I was scared that I would get bullied, a rational fear, as I have since heard stories of children being bullied because of their epilepsy. I felt very alone dealing with it. My parents were really the only people who properly empathized and were the closest to understanding what it was like. I feel really bad for them, as they were the ones that had to deal with my frustrations when it all just became a bit much. A few years go by. I'm now 15. I have another review with my pediatric neurologist. She tells me that since I haven't had any more seizures, it would be possible for me to slowly come off my medication. Fantastic news. I follow her guidance, and that's it. I'm medication-free. Shortly after turning 16, I have another review, and I've still had no seizures. So, I was told that it was likely hormonal, as my seizures occurred when I had just become a teenager. Again, more great news. I was so happy and relieved. Fast forward a bit, and I'm now 17. It's a Sunday evening, and I'm watching TV. I just seem to blink, and suddenly, I'm in the middle of the lounge floor, a pillow under my head, paramedic in the room. Although I'm absolutely exhausted and my brain feels foggy, I know what's happened. I've had another seizure. I can't help it. I just burst into tears. I'm so unbelievably disappointed. It's one of the worst feelings I've had. To be told I basically don't have epilepsy anymore, have just over a year go by, and then have another random seizure and realize that clearly I do still have epilepsy is an incredibly disappointing shock. Due to my age by then, sodium valproate was not an ideal choice of medication to go back on. As I'm sure some of you will know, it is a medication that can cause harm to babies during pregnancy, but I didn't want to have to deal with the same side effects again anyway. Therefore, this time, I was put on Keppra. I adjusted to this over time and learned the main side effect of it for me was tiredness. Since I would be starting university soon, I took a little more interest in researching epilepsy and learning any adjustments I might need to make to my daily life, which included watching how much alcohol I drink. Obviously, perhaps not the most ideal thing in terms of the social side of uni life, but, not the end of the world. Ensuring that if I had a late night, that the next day I rest and maybe try to catch up on some sleep. Another thing I was told to be wary of was stress, as this can be a seizure trigger. Not the easiest thing to avoid in your day-to-day life, as I'm sure you'd agree, but something I try to do, and that nowadays I'm a little better at. I would like to again pause here in my story. The aim of my talk today is to educate and help enhance your ability to empathize, not pity, empathize, with those of us who live with epilepsy. Yes, seeing somebody have a seizure can be scary. I will not argue that. However, it's actually far scarier for the person having the seizure and living with the condition. Some get warnings before a seizure. Others, like myself, don't, bar the one time I mentioned earlier in my story. Some people know exactly what causes their seizures. Others, like myself, don't. We can just guess. Regardless, though, we can lose little chunks of time during a seizure, which in itself is pretty disconcerting. We can always have that little nagging fear at the back of our minds that we could have a seizure at any time, and sadly, getting more serious for a moment, sudden unexpected death in epilepsy, also known as SUDEP, exists. That fear also extends to the fact that we could have a seizure in any place, so that is potentially quite dangerous. It's very difficult to push that fear away because it's very real. It took me a long time to stop letting it affect me so much and to try to put things into perspective. I know my possible triggers, tiredness and stress. I know the reasonable and sensible steps to take to help avoid or at least deal with these types of potential triggers, and I know ways to help remind myself to take my medication. There is also the impact of the seizures themselves, for example, and everyone's different, but it can sometimes take me a week or more to fully recover and feel myself again. That's how much of a physical and emotional impact it can have on me. But there is also the daily impact of actually living with this condition, the smaller parts others don't always see or realize. Getting back to my story, I'm now 23. I've returned home from work. At this stage of my life, I'm working in corporate tax. Coincidentally, I was planning on organising a bake sale and some fun activities at work to raise money for Epilepsy Scotland. But hardly anyone at work knew I had epilepsy because, as I mentioned in my promotional interview for this talk, I prefer that people get to know me as a person first before I tell them I have the condition, because I don't want that to be the first thing they think of when they think of me. But also, my epilepsy wasn't affecting my ability to do my job, so only the relevant people knew. But I decided it was probably time to be a bit more open about this. These weren't school kids I was dealing with anymore, they were adults. But naturally, this was still a big thing for me. Unfortunately, whether it was related to the stress of this or not, I ended up having a seizure in the early hours of the morning. The only difference was that it had been, what I would later find out from my neurologist, a nocturnal seizure, which is when you have a seizure in your sleep. As you can imagine, this was incredibly disappointing. I'd gone almost 6.5 years without a seizure. What made things worse this time, though, was that I now had to properly consider and research SUDEP as a potential risk with nocturnal seizures is that you could suffocate, for example, if you were sleeping on your front when the seizure occurred. This made me terrified to go to sleep for a while. However, I was told about anti-suffocation pillows, so I got 2 of those, and this helped to at least reduce my fear. Another unfortunate thing about this nocturnal seizure was that it seemed to cause horrendous migraines, which went on to impact me pretty much right up to this day, though they were at their most intense for the first few years after. The dose of medication I take at night was then increased to help protect against further nocturnal seizures. A few months later, however, I made the decision to change careers to something that might suit my personal health circumstances at the time a bit better. For example, something that might involve less screen time, as computer screens were a contributing factor to my migraines. This was when I decided to return to acting, a childhood passion of mine after attending Stagecoach Theatre Art School and the Lyceum Youth Theatre and performing in a BBC Radio 4 comedy series and on stage at the Edinburgh Playhouse Theatre when I was younger. I've been quite lucky, as epilepsy and medication side effects can sometimes impact a person's memory, which obviously would not be ideal for an actor in terms of memorising lines. However, this has not been the case for me, and my ability to learn lines has remained unaffected. I would say the most demanding thing for me about having the condition and pursuing an acting career is potential long days either on set, stage, or in rehearsals. However, as I love acting so much and want to give myself the best chance, I have slowly been experimenting with different projects and building up my capacity to cope with longer hours to the point where I feel much more confident about it. I think that often the more you fear something, the bigger a barrier it can become in your mind. At the end of the day, any role I've had or will have, I'd put all of my effort into regardless of if I started to get tired due to my medication, and I think that's what's important. Once I decided to be a bit more open about my epilepsy, I really started to become an advocate for people with the condition. We have a lot to navigate and deal with, whether it's medication side effects, social impacts, or the actual seizures themselves. Epilepsy can also result in difficulties in learning and/or behaviour. However, sometimes people with the condition face certain barriers that they shouldn't have to face, in my opinion. Several years ago, I started up #EpilepsyChats, which is a monthly Twitter chat where a different epilepsy-related topic is chosen and discussed each month based on what the online epilepsy community is interested in chatting about. I created this chat to give those with the condition, their families and friends, associated charities and medical professionals the opportunity to network, share experiences, and give each other tips. For example, if somebody was struggling with how to manage their medication side effects, others have in the past suggested things that might help. I've got to know some incredible people through this, but I've also heard some awful stories. People being bullied, unfairly treated or isolated purely because they have epilepsy, a condition they can't help having. This is not just children either. Some adults have been unfairly treated by their employers as well. Naturally, I understand that there are some specific jobs that are perhaps a bit too dangerous or unsuitable for people with epilepsy if, for example, they have daily seizures. However, it's worth remembering that, firstly, everybody with the condition is different. The person will often know themselves what they can and can't handle or do, as they'll have likely had many conversations with their neurologist beforehand and will have an understanding of what their body and brain can handle. So please, don't be put off by the word epilepsy, and that's not just for employers, but for everybody. I believe that fear and discrimination can often come from a lack of understanding and empathy, which is why I think raising awareness, such as through conferences like this one, is so important, in my opinion. Today, I've been trying to shed some light on the struggles that a lot of us with epilepsy face that are perhaps more hidden or unknown. I've come to know lots of really talented people with the condition in various lines of work, from creatives to athletes, and these people are obviously just as capable at doing things others without the condition can. It's just that they might need the odd adjustment here and there, and that should be okay. Everything they do despite having the condition, which is why I think they deserve so much credit. I've said this in my promotional interview and many times before, but I will say it again. We may have epilepsy, but epilepsy does not have us. So I hope you all go away today feeling more confident in your understanding of the condition and how it can impact people on a daily basis. But I also hope this talk leads to more acceptance and accommodation towards people with epilepsy. Thank you.